The second calculator is to calculate the number of suburb pages a client wants to add to a website. A suburb is chosen and then it will load from an API, and each of these I price at $200. There's a setting in the jQuery to store that amount, and we've got a always selected setup fee of $4.90, and down here is the summary. The unique thing about this calculator is it'll make a request to Airtable through their API to load different suburbs based on the city that is selected, and that uses Ajax, communicating with a PHP file as a proxy, and that passes through the API key that is used to get the data from Airtable. This is Airtable. It's a free online database, limited to 1,000 records and 1,000 API calls per month. So I'll briefly show you how I set that up. I created what's called a base. I call that SEO. Visiting that, I've got the cities that are loading through these radios, and then the cities are connected to the suburbs. When Gold Coast is selected, it will load in these Gold Coast suburbs. So I'll show you. And each of the suburbs you can set a unique price per suburb. So the alternative to this would be to list each one of these as variables in the JavaScript or the jQuery. So by default, when you add in the suburbs as a table, you'd have a single view which has all the cities. So then you create new views and then filter them on the city, and then in the code I reference the view name. It's Gold Coast or Brisbane. I pass that through. So here's the code for the local SEO suburb page. What you need to run jQuery code is the open tag jQuery and the closing tag. You'd put those into your functions.php if you don't have a way to edit jQuery directly on your page. You can put it into your functions.php, which is in your file manager, and then you'd go to themes. You go to WP content themes, and then your theme, and then find the functions.php, which is this one here. And this is the WordPress code to add a reference to access the head tag, and then it runs your own custom function, which you give it any name you want. And then this function here is where you'd open the script, and then you'd put your entire jQuery into there. So you put all of this script inside this, and then it would run inside the head. My theme allows me to run jQuery directly inside a page. So I've got custom code here, and then page JavaScript. And all of this code relates to this calculator. The first thing this one does is it will get the list from the Airtable, create a div and give the div a name, and that named div would be used to load in your data for these radios. So the way that I'm doing it here, I've got Ajax city load function. So as soon as this page finishes loading, this function is going to execute automatically, and it will run this function. And that makes an Ajax request, to a PHP handler. This is like running your own API on your own website. So my website, I've put this into the root folder, proxy.php, and then I can send different name value pairs. I'll show you that. So this is the proxy.php in the root folder. You've got your usual WP content, WP admin. So you just place this file in the root and then edit that. And the basics of this proxy.php is to first check the API in the query string that's passed through. So this is what I was basically passing through the table and the city view, and saying API equals Airtable. So that's the same as what's being passed through here. Table equals city, view equals city view. That makes the URL request, and the response coming back from that proxy.php is JSON. So I'll show you here. The API is checked here if it equals Airtable. This is where you put your own API key, which I've just changed. And that API key gets passed in to the headers to make a request to airtable.com. The table gets passed through and the view gets passed through, which was the table equals city and view equals city view. And then a curl request is made, and the response gets put into a variable. Then it gets handled down here, and all of the records from the data. So the data was changed up here. Data equals JSON decode response, and then the data is handled down here, and we're looking for records, fields, and the suburbs for whatever city was chosen. Otherwise, we're just listing out the cities before we select a city. So we're only going to need suburbs once a city is selected. The city view is what is being loaded at first, and that's just listing these cities. So whatever the response is, it gets echoed out as JSON, and that output is the response here. Well, it puts it into this object here, which is appended to the output container. The output container is your div. So in this case, I gave it a name of city radios. And this text field is the radios and that label above. So that text field has the div and the ID of city radios. So instead of using the API, the simpler way initially is you create these radio buttons just with HTML inside this div. Once you have those HTML elements of the radios, you handle the click on those. So I'll show you where I've got the click or the change. This is it. So city radios on change. It's focusing on whenever one of these is selected. When one of these is selected, it runs a little spinner animation. So that looks at the currently selected element, and it gets data-city view name. I'll show you the source code on the final page so that you can see that. So on the final page, you'd open up Chrome DevTools of the final result. So I've got a label and the radio for each suburb, and I'm using data-city view name. That city view name gets passed in, that's the selection as a variable. It gets passed into this function to load the suburbs for that city. So that function, Ajax suburb load, is this one here. So it's passing in the word Gold Coast as the view here in the suburbs table. So that one is going to look at the suburbs table, Gold Coast, and retrieve that list of suburbs. Those 50 suburbs are a response in JSON, just in the proxy.php. This is where they come through, they get output as JSON. The JSON comes back through this API request. The response is looped through, and the suburb name, price, and the city name is put into checkboxes container. Checkbox container is div-suburbs. It's probably this one. Yeah, this is the one here. So you just need a text element, and then you put a div inside with the ID div suburbs. So the checkbox object is created after this loops through. It's appended to the checkboxes container. So this will go through with an if statement to decide whether I previously clicked it or not. And this is, I'm using more data attributes to store the values of each suburb, like the suburb name and the price. So I'll show the calculator again once one of these is chosen. So Gold Coast, it gets the result, it puts it into the div suburbs. And once you've got all of that, you can then start selecting the checkboxes of the suburbs. So everything I've done with that API, you could instead use hard-coded HTML if you wanted to go the simpler way of doing it. When those suburbs are clicked on, it goes through whatever functionality you want to execute, which is adding up the prices. So you'd have a price function for every click you want to calculate the price. That runs after whatever your handling is there above. In my case, whenever I click on these, it's storing the values so that they can be added to this list down here. So it's getting stored in another object, and that object keeps its status between different suburbs. So if I was to choose a different suburb, and then this will refresh, and I can click a few more, it's kept a record of the previously selected. And then when I switch back to Gold Coast, it has remembered the previously selected items. So I'm storing them in selected suburbs. So when each of the suburbs is clicked, that's when you wanted to add extra, in my case $200 per suburb. You want to add them up. So we get the properties of the checkbox, and I'm using data attributes for each of those. And just having a look at one of those, we see the data attributes, the city name, suburb count, price. So that's these data attributes getting stored. So a checkbox is an object with these attributes in it. So whether a suburb is currently checked or unchecked, it gets added into or removed from the selected checkbox object, which keeps the total. It keeps each of these records in there. Calculate price is executed. So you want to execute calculate price whenever there's some action that's taken relevant to updating the price. Then you would execute the calculate price on each click function. And calculate price is this function here. And my calculate price function is used to add up the total price, so multiplied by how many services or how many checkboxes were selected. That's based on this service count here. So it's looking at how many checkboxes are checked. And it's also pushing variables and text into a summary object so that we can place that summary into the text field, which is has a summary class. So that's that text field here. If we edit that, you see the class there, summary. So it will get inserted in between this, the paragraph tags, and then the total is kept separate. So that's a class of total, and then total setup, edit these different elements. So total setup, I just put in as $0, and then whatever's between this span class that has the span elements that have that class on it will be replaced. So total is calculated based on the setup price, and then it's formatted based on the 2 decimal places. The setup price is just this value here, initial setup. That's what that's referring to, and it's using the data attribute of price. So you would use these data attributes, data-price, which is this one, to set whatever and you can hard code that in just like I did here. You could also hard code all of the suburbs similar to what I've done, or all of your services. Total price is formatted. It runs this function here, passes a price if it's over 1,000, putting the 1,000 separator in there, so just so that it appears nicer to look at down here. So that becomes total. View the source to my page. Well, what you first need is just the script tag, output from your head. But in my case, I'm just outputting it on the page, so it's further down the page. And then you've got your jQuery opener, and all the functions are available there. You could potentially change this URL to reference a text file locally. If you need to access a large amount of data, it's better to store that as JSON. You could hard code some JSON into a text file, and then you load the text file. That way you don't have to set up a PHP file, and you don't have to set up Airtable. You just hard code the JSON as text and just load the TXT file through here. And that should work a very similar way. And for my setup, all I'm doing is outputting the calculations. I don't have anything else that is supposed to take place after that, but you could integrate this with a form or whatever method that you need, or to have it send or submit through an email function. So what we went over was load your calculator using jQuery in your WP head through the functions.php, and then using click functions and calculate price functions. So whenever your objects are clicked on, you would execute calculate price. You also need the JSON file to store the data and retrieve it through Ajax. If you don't want to use JSON, if you want to hard code the data, so if you were to hard code all of this, I'll copy that. Then I've opened up that element with the div suburbs, and that's where I'll paste that in. So that's hard coding those elements there. It's the div and then each of those. Let me know if you've got any questions, or if you need this source code. I'll add it into the YouTube description.